I was the one who found him. Curled in his armchair, one slipper missing, his reading glasses still hooked over one ear. The house was silent except for the steady tick of the grandfather clock. And just like that, my world shifted. Grandpa Harold was gone. A week later, my mother blamed me for his death. She said it with that particular tone she used when she wanted to cut deep but look innocent. "If you'd been checking in more," she whispered as she straightened his tie in the casket, "maybe he wouldn't have died alone." I didn't answer her. There are things you don't respond to, not because they're true, but because engaging would grant them legitimacy. That moment, standing by his body while she turned grief into a dagger, broke something in me I hadn't known was holding on. I'm Amber. I'm 29. And last month, my grandfather left me everything: the estate, the business shares, the house by the lake, and the silence that now echoes in every room of my childhood. He left me $2 million worth of responsibility and consequences. And a family who thinks I stole what they were owed. My mother, Patricia, didn't even wait a full day after the funeral before demanding I do the right thing and sign it all over to her. When I refused, she called a family meeting. This morning, I walked into her house and found everyone waiting. My siblings, my stepfather, 2 lawyers I didn't recognize, and my mother, wearing her best pearls and a predatory smile. "Remember," she said with a voice smooth as glass, "meet our lawyers." I didn't sit down. I didn't greet anyone. I just stood there, aware of how small I felt in that moment, and how dangerous that feeling could become if I let it take root. What happened next didn't shock me. But the way they went about it, that part I'll never forget. I always knew I was different from them. Not just in how I spoke, how I listened, how I made decisions. But in the things I cherished. I didn't learn about love from my mother. I learned it from Grandpa Harold. He taught it with his consistency, the way he showed up on the sidelines of every science fair, every graduation, every Tuesday when no one else remembered I had piano lessons. He never made a spectacle of his care. It was quiet. Practical. Unwavering. When I was 9, he gave me a journal with a green leather cover. Inside, he wrote, "When the world is loud, be still. Your thoughts matter." I filled that journal in a month. My mother found it once, read a few pages without asking, then mocked me at dinner for being melodramatic. I never wrote in front of her again. Harold was the only one who noticed when I stopped trying to win my mother's approval. He didn't ask me to mend what had long been broken. He just offered space. A chair in his study. A cup of tea before bedtime. Silence that felt like respect. He never spoke ill of her. But when she yelled, when she bought things she couldn't afford, when she played the victim in front of others, I watched him go still, eyes distant, as if trying not to feed the flame. I learned that skill from him too. My siblings weren't cruel, exactly. Just indifferent. Rachel was always occupied with cosmetic appointments or self-improvement retreats she never paid for. Jason lived off the idea of needing support because of his special learning style, which conveniently meant he didn't have to work. My stepfather Craig was quiet unless he was drunk. Then he was mean. Not physically. Just enough to ruin dinner with a single sarcastic comment. He never defended me. I stopped expecting him to by the time I was 14. Still, every holiday, I came back. I brought gifts. I offered help. I stood in the kitchen washing dishes while the others left their plates. Harold once touched my shoulder as I scrubbed a stubborn pan and said, "You don't have to earn what you already deserve." But I didn't believe him until he died and left me everything. The day after the will was read, Patricia stormed into my apartment uninvited. She was furious but measured, like someone rehearsing grief through clenched teeth. "You're not thinking clearly," she said. "This was supposed to go to the family. You can't seriously intend to keep it." I replied, "Grandpa made his decision." She stepped closer. "Because you manipulated him." That part stung. Not because it was true, but because it was what she needed to believe. That someone else's loyalty had to be stolen, not earned. I didn't raise my voice. I simply asked her to leave. She did, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the framed photo of Harold on my bookshelf. In that photo, he was standing in front of his first store, sleeves rolled up, eyes bright with pride. I used to imagine that photo was of my own father, though I never said that out loud. Especially not to Craig. I tried to grieve. I really did. But grief requires space. And my family saw Harold's death not as loss, but as opportunity. Calls came daily. Some thinly disguised as check-ins. Others more direct. "You know he only left it to you because you were there when he was sick," Rachel said over speakerphone while I filed his final business reports. He wasn't thinking straight. Jason sent a group text, "Since it's all in Amber's name now, can she finally help me buy that hybrid van for therapy transport?" Grandpa would have wanted it. Not once did anyone ask how I was doing. How I was sleeping. If I'd eaten. It wasn't until I spoke to the estate attorney that I realized just how much Harold had protected me. He'd set up separate bank accounts, independent trusts, even instructions for what to do if anyone tried to dispute the will. He'd been precise, thoughtful, deeply intentional. It made me ache with gratitude. And then came the text about the family meeting. That morning, I drove back to my childhood neighborhood, past the cracked sidewalks and dying rose bushes Patricia never cared enough to trim. The house looked smaller than I remembered, more brittle. As if the absence of Harold had hollowed it out. Inside, everything was staged. Patricia had rearranged the living room to look more elegant than it had any right to be. My siblings sat on the couch like restless spectators. Craig poured whiskey into a coffee mug at 10 a.m., avoiding my eyes. Two men in tailored suits stood by the fireplace. I assumed they were lawyers until one opened a briefcase and pulled out a document thick enough to be a manuscript. "We'd like to propose an adjustment," one of them said. I looked at Patricia. Her smile was tight, victorious. She thought this was checkmate. But I didn't flinch. I didn't ask what was in the folder. I already knew. They weren't just asking me to hand over Harold's estate. They were going to try and scare me into it. And for a moment, I almost pitied them. Because they thought I was still the girl in the corner, always cleaning up after everyone. They had no idea what Harold taught me in those quiet Saturday afternoons in the back office of his store. I took a step closer, calm and deliberate. "You really think this is going to work?" Patricia didn't answer. But Jason did. He said, "It better. Because otherwise, you're not family anymore." I turned to him slowly. And I smiled. I smiled because I finally understood something. They weren't just trying to intimidate me. They were hoping I'd collapse under the same pressure I had endured since childhood, the pressure to keep the peace, to shoulder the burden, to be the quiet, competent daughter who never asked for anything. But that version of me no longer existed. As I stood in front of them, I realized what Harold had seen all along. I wasn't their helper anymore. I wasn't their buffer or their insurance policy. The men in suits, one of them named Daniel, explained they had drawn up a revised estate agreement. Patricia interrupted to insist it was for the sake of unity. Jason chimed in about fairness. Rachel simply adjusted her lip gloss and looked bored. I didn't touch the papers. Instead, I said, "You're not entitled to anything." That silenced the room for a moment. A second too long. Craig scoffed. He said, "That's not how families work, Amber. We share." I looked at him, really looked, and saw what Harold must have seen for decades. The empty suit, the leech in a borrowed house. I replied, "Sharing assumes contribution." "You've all taken." Rachel rolled her eyes. Jason muttered something about being done with this. Patricia remained still, watching me like I was some misbehaving employee. That's when the manipulation shifted. The pity card came next. Patricia said, "I know you're hurting. We all are. You don't have to isolate yourself just because you feel guilty." The implication hit me square in the chest. She wanted me to believe this was grief acting out. That I was emotionally unstable. That the only path to redemption, to reconnection, was to surrender the one thing that proved Harold trusted me more than he ever trusted her. And for a fleeting moment, I felt the pull. The longing for peace, for approval, for someone in that room to just say, "We see you. We respect you." But silence was still the loudest voice in that house. So I did what Harold taught me. I stayed calm. I stood still. I refused to flinch. Daniel asked if I'd at least consider a partial transfer, just the main property, or maybe the shares in the business. He was polite, practiced, and clearly unfamiliar with who he was dealing with. I said, no. Patricia stood up then, her voice a notch sharper. Then you're cutting us out. All of us. No, I said, softly. I'm setting boundaries. Craig slammed his mug down. Jason cursed under his breath. Rachel sighed dramatically. And Patricia, she just stared. I left the folder untouched. When I got home, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall until the light changed. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I just felt the weight of what I had done. What I had said. What I had finally refused to become. The silence that night wasn't peaceful. It was full of echoes. But even in the noise of doubt, I felt something stronger. The beginnings of resolve. Because what they didn't understand, what they never would, was that this wasn't about money. It was about legacy. About loyalty. About love that had been earned, not claimed. And I wasn't going to let them rewrite the ending. Not this time. Not ever. I smiled because I finally understood something. They weren't just trying to intimidate me. They were hoping I'd collapse under the same pressure I had endured since childhood, the pressure to keep the peace, to shoulder the burden, to be the quiet, competent daughter who never asked for anything. But that version of me no longer existed. As I stood in front of them, I realized what Harold had seen all along. I wasn't their helper anymore. I wasn't their buffer or their insurance policy. The men in suits, one of them named Daniel, explained they had drawn up a revised estate agreement. Patricia interrupted to insist it was for the sake of unity. Jason chimed in about fairness. Rachel simply adjusted her lip gloss and looked bored. I didn't touch the papers. Instead, I said, "You're not entitled to anything." That silenced the room for a moment. A second too long. Craig scoffed. He said, "That's not how families work, Amber. We share." I looked at him, really looked, and saw what Harold must have seen for decades. The empty suit, the leech in a borrowed house. I replied, "Sharing assumes contribution. You've all taken." Rachel rolled her eyes. Jason muttered something about being done with this. Patricia remained still, watching me like I was some misbehaving employee. That's when the manipulation shifted. The pity card came next. Patricia said, "I know you're hurting. We all are. You don't have to isolate yourself just because you feel guilty." The implication hit me square in the chest. She wanted me to believe this was grief acting out. That I was emotionally unstable. That the only path to redemption, to reconnection, was to surrender the one thing that proved Harold trusted me more than he ever trusted her. And for a fleeting moment, I felt the pull. The longing for peace, for approval, for someone in that room to just say, "We see you. We respect you." But silence was still the loudest voice in that house. So I did what Harold taught me. I stayed calm. I stood still. I refused to flinch. Daniel asked if I'd at least consider a partial transfer, just the main property, or maybe the shares in the business. He was polite, practiced, and clearly unfamiliar with who he was dealing with. I said, no. Patricia stood up then, her voice a notch sharper. Then you're cutting us out. All of us. No, I said, softly. I'm setting boundaries. Craig slammed his mug down. Jason cursed under his breath. Rachel sighed dramatically. And Patricia, she just stared. I left the folder untouched. When I got home, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall until the light changed. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I just felt the weight of what I had done. What I had said. What I had finally refused to become. The silence that night wasn't peaceful. It was full of echoes. But even in the noise of doubt, I felt something stronger. The beginnings of resolve. Because what they didn't understand, what they never would, was that this wasn't about money. It was about legacy. About loyalty. About love that had been earned, not claimed. And I wasn't going to let them rewrite the ending. Not this time. Not ever. I didn't sleep the night before the meeting. Not out of fear. Not even out of anger. It was the stillness that kept me awake, the realization that I had reached the point where silence no longer felt like safety, but readiness. I knew I would confront them. Not just with words. But with truth, and records, and the quiet weight of everything they thought I wouldn't dare use. I started preparing 2 weeks before. First, I reviewed the trust paperwork Harold had stored in the safe behind his office bookshelf. The originals were there, notarized and dated, with a letter addressed to me in his handwriting. It simply said, "If they try, protect what matters." So I began documenting everything. Not for revenge, but for clarity. For proof. I contacted Harold's accountant. I spoke to his old business partner. I pulled bank statements, land records, shareholder reports. I discovered my mother had attempted to pressure Harold into selling the company 5 years ago, and he'd quietly removed her as a financial consultant in response. There were emails. Records of money loaned and never returned. Checks written by Harold to cover Jason's rehab, Rachel's failed boutique, Craig's gambling debts. It wasn't just that they didn't deserve a share. They had already received more than they ever acknowledged. The morning of the confrontation, I arrived 10 minutes early. This time, I chose the venue, Harold's office above the hardware store. It hadn't changed. The framed photos still lined the walls. His cologne still lingered faintly in the worn leather chair. I sat behind his desk. I laid out folders for each of them. Inside, I included their own history, in his handwriting, not mine. Notes Harold had kept. Not to expose them, but to remember where he'd drawn the line. They came in one by one. Patricia was first, wearing sunglasses despite the cloudy day. Jason followed, then Rachel. Craig didn't show, which was predictable. They looked uncomfortable in the space. Patricia said, "Why here?" I replied, "Because this is where he made his decisions." Jason picked up his folder. "What is this?" I said nothing. I waited. One by one, they opened the files. The silence that followed wasn't shock. It was insult. How dare I remember what they had tried to erase? Rachel said, "This is ancient history. You're being vindictive." I answered, "No. I'm being thorough." Patricia's voice cracked a little when she finally spoke. "You had no right to go through his private records." "He left them to me," I said. "All of it." Jason's face reddened. "This doesn't change anything. He still made a mistake. He still cut out his own daughter." I looked directly at him. He made a choice. The room felt colder. But I didn't rush. I didn't argue. I let the silence stretch until it bent around them. Patricia finally sat. And for the first time, she looked tired. Not angry. Just worn. "So what now?" she asked. I told them the truth. That the estate would remain exactly as Harold intended. That there would be no revisions, no partial transfers, no settlements. But I also made one unexpected offer. I told them I would fund a memorial scholarship in Harold's name, something he had talked about years ago but never finalized. It would support students pursuing trades, just like he once did. And it would come entirely from my share. Rachel asked, "Why would you do that? After everything?" I said, "Because that's what he wanted. And I'm not doing it for you." Jason scoffed, but didn't speak again. Patricia said nothing. When they left, they didn't say goodbye. But they didn't threaten anything either. It wasn't victory. It wasn't closure. But it was final. And as the door clicked shut behind them, I leaned back in Harold's chair. Not to claim his place, but to honor what he built. And just for a moment, I could almost hear his voice again. Quiet. Steady. Proud. They didn't come back. Not with lawyers. Not with letters. Not even with apologies. And somehow, that made it feel more real, not like a battle I had won, but a silence I had chosen. In the weeks that followed, I buried myself in Harold's world. I reorganized the books in his study. I spent mornings in the store office going through the ledgers he still balanced by hand. I found yellowed receipts, old notes, and a worn photo of me taped behind his calendar. It was a picture from when I was 11, holding a wrench with grease on my chin. He'd written in pen beneath it, "Fix what matters." So that's what I did. The scholarship fund came first. I contacted the local high school, set up the trust, designed the application forms myself. I made sure no one in my family could touch it. Then I funded it with a quiet wire transfer and didn't tell a soul. The second thing I did was change the locks at the lake house. Not out of paranoia. Just peace. I repainted the porch swing white and replaced the broken gate latch Harold had meant to fix. I planted marigolds along the walk, because I remembered he liked their stubbornness, the way they bloomed even when the soil turned dry. People in town started to notice. Not the flashy kind of notice. Just respectful nods. A few old customers began stopping by to ask if the business would continue. I told them yes. Quietly, carefully, yes. Rachel emailed once. A single line, "I hope you're happy." I didn't answer. Jason posted something vague on social media about betrayal. I didn't comment. But his tone softened. He stopped tagging me in family photos he knew I wasn't in. Craig never resurfaced. Patricia waited the longest. Then one afternoon, I found an envelope on my doorstep. No return address. Inside was a note. "I still don't understand why he chose you. But I won't fight anymore." No signature. No warmth. But I kept the letter. Not because it meant reconciliation. But because it meant retreat. Some days I questioned whether I had been too harsh. Other days I remembered how long I had been taught to forget myself. I met with Harold's lawyer one last time to finalize the property transitions. He handed me a small safety deposit box and said, "He left this. Said you'd know when to open it." I waited a week before I did. Inside was a flash drive. On it, a single video, Harold, in his study, speaking directly to the camera. He said, "If you're watching this, they've tested you. And I want you to know, you don't owe them softness. You owe yourself peace. And that starts by refusing to carry what isn't yours." I watched it twice. Then I cried. Not from sadness. From recognition. From relief. There was a letter, too. One I hadn't expected. He wrote, "You don't need my approval. But if you ever doubt yourself, remember this, I saw you. I chose you. Not out of sentiment. Out of truth." That night, I walked down to the lake alone. The wind was sharp. The sky cloudless. I let my bare feet sink into the dirt where Harold used to plant tomatoes. I whispered goodbye. Not to him, but to the version of myself who waited for them to come around. They weren't coming. And for the first time, that felt like freedom. I didn't know healing could be so quiet. It didn't arrive like sunlight or song. It arrived like an unlocked door, nothing dramatic, just the absence of resistance. I walked through it without announcement. That fall, I reopened the store. Not officially. Just on Saturdays. People came in slowly, out of habit more than need. They asked for nails, batteries, sometimes a story. I gave them all 3. I didn't mention Harold much. I didn't have to. His name was in the wood, in the dust, in the drawer labels he'd written in pen 30 years ago. Sometimes I'd sit behind the counter and read. Sometimes I'd fix clocks just to hear them tick again. And once, when a little boy knocked over a bin of washers and tried not to cry, I knelt beside him and said, "It's okay. Some things sound worse than they are." He smiled. I thought Harold would have liked that. Patricia didn't reach out again. Rachel sent a birthday card. No note. Just her name and a glittery sticker of a star. It felt like the kind of piece you send when you're still afraid to say the truth. Jason moved states. I heard from someone he started a new job, something in outdoor therapy. I hoped he meant it this time. The lake house became my own sanctuary. Not out of defense, but choice. I painted the guest room blue. I learned to make sourdough. I sat on the porch swing Harold never got to use and let silence teach me what love had tried to say all along. I wasn't angry anymore. That was the strangest part, learning that forgiveness didn't mean letting them back in. It just meant I didn't have to carry their story as mine. Once, I ran into a woman at the farmer's market who had known Harold. She said, "He used to call you his North Star. Always knew where he stood when you were around." I didn't cry. I just nodded. I thought of the journal he gave me. Of the wrench. Of the words behind the photo, "Fix what matters." And I realized I had. Not everything. Not everyone. But enough. Enough to stand without proving. To speak without defending. To love without asking. I kept the scholarship fund anonymous. Every year, I read the essays. I never reach out. But I always feel something when I see the winner's name printed in the local paper, one name chosen because someone believed in their worth before they had to earn it. The way Harold did with me. The way I try to do with myself now. Some things still ache. But they no longer define. Some names still sting. But they no longer decide. And some legacies are made not by inheritance, but by refusal. Refusal to repeat what broke you. Refusal to hand down silence in place of truth. Refusal to let love be defined by absence. So when I walk the edge of the lake now, I don't whisper goodbye. I whisper thank you. And I keep walking.